Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks very much for coming to our panel, Democracy in the Left. I guess we originally kind of scheduled this to be in the aftermath of Brexit Day, but that hasn't quite worked out. But I guess it's still something of a hot topic on the left, this question of democracy, which is kind of coming up with the sort of ongoing political crisis around Brexit. So it hopefully will be a good discussion. Just a few words on Platypus. So what we do, we're an international organisation. We've got chapters on campuses, mainly in America, but also in Europe. So in the UK, we've got two in London and one in Manchester, as well as here. We, as you can see, our kind of one slogan / provocation is the left is dead, long live the left. And that's what we kind of set out to investigate, I suppose. So we published the Platypus Review, which is just a bunch of PRs are over on that table, and it's an open submission journal, and we're always on the lookout for people to basically come and write for us. And they're free to take as well. So feel free to peruse afterwards. In Sheffield, we hold a weekly reading group. It's kind of spanning the history of the left and of Marxism, beginning with the radical bourgeois philosophy of the 18th century, and then going through the kind of gamut of Marxism, and then finishing with the Frankfurt School. Also we have coffee breaks every week, which are kind of a bit more informal. We talk about contemporary articles on the left or stuff that's been published in the Platypus Review. And we're going to have one tomorrow as well, so that'll be at 5 in interval, and if anyone wants to come along for some post-match analysis, or to digest what we're going to talk about tonight, please feel free. That's also going to be coinciding with an AGM that we're going to do, so we need 3 current students who are continuing next year, basically to fill our committee roles. It's extremely low commitment. It just allows us to kind of have book rooms and be kind of fully functioning as a campus organisation. Without further ado, I'll introduce our panelists and then read out a panel description for tonight and some questions for the panelists to address. So furthest away from me is Anton Jäger, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, writing on the history of the 19th century populist movement in the United States. He's also recently had a number of articles published in Jäger magazine on the concept of populism in contemporary political science, the prospect of left populism, and the idea of a post-work society. And then nearer to me is Patrick Finan. He's
fine.
Oh, fine. Oh, I'm racist. Sorry. Patrick, fine man, who's a local activist and writer, and is a member of the Alliance for Workers' Liberty here in Sheffield. We were going to have, if people were paying attention to our advertising, we were going to have a third person, but alas, he's dropped out at the last minute, basically. So anyway, we soldier on. So the panel description, I'll just read that out. From Brexit and the French Yellow Vests to the AfD in Germany, the present centre of political attention is the crisis being expressed through democratic politics, both within the nation-state and at the level of the EU. How should the left understand and relate to this crisis? More broadly speaking, what is the history informing the demands for greater democracy today, and how does the left adequately promote, or not, the cause of popular empowerment? And then 5 questions for panellists. What is the relationship between democracy and the working class today? Do you consider historical struggles for democracy by workers as the medium by which they were assimilated to the system, or the only path to emancipation that they couldn't avoid trying to take? 2, do you consider it as necessary to eschew established forms of mass politics in favour of new forms in order to build a democratic movement? Or are current mass forms of politics adequate for a democratic society? 3, why is democracy emerged as the primary demand of spontaneous forms of discontent? Do you consider it necessary or adequate to deal with the pathologies of our era? 4, Engels wrote that a revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. Do you agree? can this conception be compatible with the struggle for democracy? And finally, 5, is democracy oppressive or can it be such? How would you judge Lenin's formulation that democracy is also a state and that consequently democracy will also disappear when the state disappears? I'll hand over to Anton. We can do it kind of right to left.
Sorry,
Anton, take it away.
I'm not dissing you on looking up a quote.
Well, it's fine, no problem. I think I was supposed to talk for about 20 minutes, so I'll try and stick to my time. I'll try and respond to some of the questions which were formulated in the outline. I can't promise I'll provide an answer to all of them. I think I'll try and tie together some strands which might be quite heterogeneous, so I try not to be too chaotic. But I want to talk about democracy on the left today, in an electoral setting, but also in a broader setting. And I want to look at the past a bit, and then I want to return to the contemporary scene. And the kind of final argument I want to make is, I want to make a distinction between what I think Engels and Lenin once called the struggle for democracy and the struggle of democracy, which is a kind of running distinction in sort of the early 20th century, when communists and socialists still found themselves almost obliged to fight for the extension of suffrage. And I want to say that practically, because of the left in such a weak state, or almost inexistent state today, finds itself again condemned to fight for the struggle for democracy rather than of democracy. And I think the left habit today to fight, or to think that it's fighting the fight of democracy rather than the fight for democracy, is actually putting the cart before the horse and making life quite difficult for them. So as we know, democracy is a concept both elusive and very omnipresent in the contemporary left. So almost 150 years after Friedrich Engels proclaimed the battle for democracy as one of the communist supreme goals, there are now as many types of democracy as there are brands in supermarkets. We have participatory democracy, social democracy, neoliberal democracy, market democracy, direct democracy, indirect democracy, liberal democracy, representative democracy. All these seem to have their own virtues. It's not very clear what they all have to do with communism, both in historical and contemporary sense. As usual, Engels realized this danger quite early on. So this is from an 1884 letter to Kugelmann, in which Kugelmann had, I think, compiled a pamphlet for a German agrarian party called the People's Party. And what he said to Kugelmann was, the only sore point in your letter there is that the concept of democracy is invoked. That concept changes every time the demos changes, and so it does not get us one step further. What he said is the proletariat too needs democratic forms for the seizure of political power, but they are for it, like all political forms, mere means. But if today democracy is wanted as an end, it is necessary to rely on the peasantry and petty bourgeoisie, that is, on the classes that are in the process of dissolution and reactionary in relation to the proletariat when they try to maintain themselves artificially. It must not be forgotten that it is precisely the democratic republic which is the logical form of bourgeois rule. A form, however, that has become too dangerous only because of the level of development the proletariat has already reached. And in a different letter, Engels even cautioned that at the eve of the revolution, all the forces of reaction will be united against us under one and the same banner, which is the banner of democracy. Now I want to start with a sort of familiar narrative that I've settled mainly in historiographical debates, but not only in the Marxist tradition, but also in sort of more mainstream traditions. So often is it assumed that communists might have won the battle for democracy in the 1920s, i.e. the extension of suffrage across the population, achieved in European states mainly in the 1920s, and only achieved in the colonial sphere in the 1960s, but not the battle of democracy, i.e. the left's attempt to pose as the ultimate majoritarian force in society that could heighten political struggle into a social struggle. In this case, of course, there was one country in which the battle of democracy was won, which was Russia, but it didn't prove to be very durable vis-à-vis the world revolution which was happening at the time. And since the battle for democracy was won in the 1920s, mainly the European working classes got suffrage after the war, Marxists, after defeat of the revolution, have had to switch to a different language. This is often the language of hegemony and how they could build this kind of majoritarian consensus in the context of universal suffrage. This is still the battle of the left today, so the reason Gramsci is still so popular, even in the Labour Party, but also with Navarro, for example, is because Gramsci is essentially a theorist of defeat. He's someone who's written for an era in which the world revolution had failed, a lot of communist parties found themselves entrenched within their national states, and now had to switch to different tactics to actually assure that the battle of democracy could be won in a different light. But what I want to argue today, however, is that this battle of democracy, or this so-called battle for hegemony, which Gramsci described, has actually become obsolete in a certain sense. And what the left is facing is not a battle of democracy, but is a battle again for democracy, to fight the sort of widening disenfranchisement of the masses, not only in Europe, but across the planet. And what we see in something like the Gilets jaunes or in the Brexit vote are sort of really desperate and last expressions of people who yearn for some kind of democratic voice and who don't really have any other means to express themselves in this sense. And the left's response to this has not only been inadequate, it's been wholly in existence, because I think that it doesn't quite realize that these people don't want to fight their battle of democracy. They just want to restart the battle for democracy that was first waged by Communist Party and Socialist Party, or Social Democratic parties in the opening of the 20th century. And I think this has a lot to do with the reason the left finds itself again in a situation where it has to fight the battle for democracy, with another movement that was started in the 1920s, after the failure of the World Revolution, which was still abhorred by the fact that socialist parties were now able to get into government, were actually able to manage capitalist states. And that was the neoliberal movement. So when you look at arch neoliberals such as Friedrich Hayek or Ludwig von Mises, the kind of formative period for them is always the period of the 1920s, when social democratic parties get into government for the first time, they actually start intervening in their economies, and they do so with a democratic mandate. And the lifelong project of someone like Hayek was also to make sure that this battle for democracy, which had been won by social democratic parties in the 1920s, would be reversed. And there would be a kind of return to the period before the First World War, in which disenfranchisement was a social fact, but in which there would be enough constitutional safeguards, there would be enough constitutional checks to make sure that this battle for democracy could never really start again in that way. And I think it's the fact that there has been a reversal in that relationship that really confuses the left today. And I think one of the facts why it confuses the left is because the left itself has been partly complicit in the sort of Hayekian drive to actually reignite the battle for democracy. And I think you can see this clearly in the way Hayek and the neoliberals fought what they saw as the integration of the working classes into the state. So the 1920s see the first socialist governments across Europe who now have to manage capitalist states. They see the ascension of loads of workers into these positions of government. And the idea which then in the 1950s, 1960s becomes ever more prevalent on the left is the idea that there's been an integration or a sort of assimilation of the working classes into the capitalist state. And this is often called the so-called integration thesis, which was mainly launched by Marcuse also in the 1960s. And the idea is basically that the working class has lost its revolutionary potential, certainly after the 1920s, but also of the 1950s, because it's just become a sort of corporatist entity within the national state. And by the fact that it was now able to engage in consumption, that it had a say through trade unions, but that it still had a sort of pact with the bourgeoisie, the working class had essentially lost its revolutionary potential. So this was the so-called integration thesis, which they thought hampered revolutionary activity, mainly in the 1960s. And this is actually a crucial incentive for the New Left, because the big riddle the New Left confronts is a working class that is integrated into the state, and therefore can no longer engage in revolutionary activity in that way. And I mean, we could talk about the integration thesis for quite a long time, but there are several things I want to say is that although the integration of the working classes, both into the factory, through Fordism, and both through the state, through something like post-war corporatism, was definitely the product of defeat, it was also a paradoxical victory. So precisely because these working class parties were assimilated into the state, it also allowed them a form of power which was not available before. And you can clearly see this in the 1960s, for example, where Belgium, which is a country that really has one of the most ambitious welfare states in the 1950s, which decasualizes its labor markets, which makes for all these provisions for working class consumption, still experiences like a really ferocious series of strikes. I mean, one of the biggest strikes in the 20th century is the 1960 to 1961 general strike in Belgium, which actually happens with a labor force that's presumed to be completely integrated. So it is a huge problem even for left-wing radicals in the 1960s, because they say, well, if the working class really is integrated into the state, why is it still revolting? Why is it still taking up arms, even against the state that it's supposed to cater to it? Even something like the 1968 revolt in France, which is the biggest general strike in France in the 20th century, happened with a labor force that was supposed to be assimilated, that was supposed to be pacified in that sense. And I think one of the ironies of what happened afterwards is that although there were still massive strikes and there was still labor militancy, this labor militancy was never able to translate itself into a kind of revolutionary upheaval. And where it took the New Left at that time is basically to answer this integration thesis with a sort of program of disintegration. And this, I think, also explains their complicity in neoliberalism. So the idea was actually to liberate the proletariat or the working classes from the fetters of the state, to liberate it from these decasualized labor markets,
to recasualize labour markets, to make the proletariat mobile again, because once the proletariat is mobile again, once it has no access to secure contracts anymore, it will gain its revolutionary potential again. There are different variations on this theme in new left-wing thinking in the 1960s and 1970s, but they all share a sort of obsession with breaking that integration of the working class into the state. And of course, the tragic result of it was a form of disintegration, but it was not a revolutionary form of disintegration. Neoliberals had a plan for the disintegration of the working class, which they had been waiting for a long time, and the new left was completely caught aback when they saw that the neoliberals were actually able to carry out that program way more convincingly than they themselves. And I think this is the actual sort of terrain on which what is today called left populism actually thrives. Left populism is the product of successive defeats, but it's mainly the product of the devastation of that kind of working class civil society, which is built up in the post-war period. It is a product of disintegration in the sense that it inherits a form of politics that is very media-centric, that is highly digitalized to some extent, but that does not really rely on any of the institutions of the post-war period. And what this has led to is what a lot of people call the so-called situation of ruling the void, what the political scientist Peter Mayer called ruling the void, is there is now a huge gap between citizenries and states. And what you see with left populism is that it embraces this prevailing obsession with discourse, precisely because there are no organs left that can actually attach the working class or civil society in general to the state. And the Hungarian critic Peter Ksigo once compared this situation to staring at smoke signals from a faraway continent without ever undertaking the journey to that continent itself. So if politicians do undertake the voyage to that continent, we can think of, for example, former Labour leader Ed Miliband's attempt to consume a bacon sandwich in 2015. The results tend to be incriminating. They only further expose the person's secession from a social base. So to many on the left, Miliband laid bare a very inconvenient truth. As Chris Bickerton wrote last year, today's parties of the left tend to be so socially deracinated that they hardly have any idea what it is that the people want. Lacking bases within parties, politicians are therefore condemned to a form of ceaseless popular will speculation. They basically have to conjure up what it might be that people want. And this leads to what the academic Joe Kennedy has beautifully called so-called politics of authentocracy. So people who reign in the name of authenticity because they have no real connection to a working class base. So Kennedy's authentocrats profess a conservatism imputed to a notion of forgotten working class and obsess over working class opposition to immigration. So his prototype is the Labour MP Owen Smith. When Smith decided to run for Labour leader in 2016, he pretended not to know the name for a latte, although he worked for a pharmaceutical company his whole life, and he called it a frothy coffee instead. He also constantly strutted his blokish credentials, and he used words such as birds and lads on Twitter. So Kennedy's authentocrats offer a semblance of authenticity at a time when authenticity itself has become a media product. And I think it's very difficult to understand this brand of left populism, or the kind of populism Smith practices, without looking at the broader decline of party democracy in Europe. So in the last 30 years, Europe's once potent parties have experienced a sort of universal decline. The German SPD went from 600,000 members in 1986 to only 400,000 in 2003. Labour went from 700,000 to 200,000. Of course, this has been reversed recently, but it's not clear that that's been a sort of durable tactic to actually counter that decline. The Dutch socialists are on the brink of disappearing. The Italian communists already disappeared in the 1990s. And we can clearly see, for example, in Germany now that the SPD is trailing behind the AfD in the latest polls. So, I mean, this is a party that has set out the party landscape for almost 60 years that is now being obliterated by a far-right party. The result of this hollowing out of European party politics was aptly described by the Irish political scientist, as I said, Peter Mayer, as ruling the void. European politicians now have so little idea of what is at play in their populations that they have to speculate what might constitute a successful program. Since parties themselves could no longer provide this kind of information, you have to look for other channels. Most of those channels are situated within the PR industry. So instead of listening to a base or obeying party machines, politicians turn to spin doctors. And spin doctors provide periodic reports on the state of public opinion or what might be popular. We can see that in the tactic of someone like Peter Mandelson, but also Lynton Crosby, who helped David Cameron get his premiership in 2015. And what is also in the background of this is actually a profound institutional change at the heart of a lot of European states. So a lot of European states in the last 20 years have experienced a rupture between two activities that were conjoined in the post-war era, politics and policy. So we can think of the latter as the methods by which states order their societies, how they intervene in their economies, how they restructure economic life, while something like politics is the process of what political theories call will formation, competition between parties in an electoral setting, campaign building, the building of coalitions, for example. And what you saw in the 1990s is that those two moments were completely separated. So policy became the domain of unelected power. We can think of like the Eurogroup, we can think of the European Commission, we can think of the Bank of England, where politics became something that only happened in the media, that only happened on the internet as we know it today. And often in the 1990s there were still some theorists of civil society who hoped that this like freeing up of civil society would actually liberate politics to some extent. But things turned out to be depressingly different. So rather than creating space, destruction of the collective institutions in the 1980s, namely Thatcher's crushing of the union movement, Socialist President François Mitterrand's gutting of the French Communist Party, also the aging membership of a lot of conservative parties, laid the basis for far more elusive forms of collectivity. And those elusive forms of collectivity we can see on the internet in full flourish, but we can also see them in a lot of far-right parties which are now thriving on the European continent. But what this had led to, mainly this situation of ruling the void, is that the repertoire of political action available to the European, but even the global working classes, has become precariously small. There are very few ways in which people can actually still express social grievance today, mainly because mainstream democratic channels have become completely exhausted. And I want to say that there's a certain truth to the idea then that we live in an era of riots, not because this is necessarily a good thing, but riots are a sort of final recourse for people who don't have any representative institutions at their disposal to actually voice anything else. So this is what the Gilets jaunes in Paris also say all the time. Our choice is literally between voting every 5 years for parties which have been choreographed and organized to such a suffocating extent. All these people are basically prepared by technocrats, and then we have to say yes or no to one or another manager, or burning down a luxury store in the heart of Paris. So this is exactly the response a lot of Gilets jaunes give to the charge of rioting. Well, they only listen to us when we burn things down. This is the only political action that still allows us to have a say in political affairs today. And this is what I want to say, is that what the Corbynite left, but even the mainstream left populist left in Europe now sees itself as doing, namely waging the battle of democracy, is actually just, again, a battle for democracy. What the working class is doing today is not simply reclaiming its status as a class, but just reclaiming basic modes of democratic expression, which have been ravaged by the last 30 years of neoliberalism. It's not a revolt against capitalism, it's a revolt against the political devastation of neoliberalism. And I don't think the left should confuse it for anything else in this sense. And of course, a lot of people have said that the left, in case of the Brexit vote, but also in case of the Gilets jaunes, has completely abdicated. But there's something really interesting about the word abdication, namely you can only abdicate once you're a king. You have to be in a position of power to actually say that I'm abdicating and refusing to take responsibility. It's not that the left has abdicated, it's that the left doesn't even have the power to abdicate in that sense. It's merely trailing behind these developments and confusing them for something they're not. I think part of this is an undigested historical heritage. So today's left, or the millennial left as we know it today, tries to combine both aspects of the old left from pre-1960s and aspects of the new left. So it wants both the kind of old left Puritanism and the new left libertinism. It both wants the social network of Facebook, but it also wants old-style unions. And in a sense, it's not a solely subjective contradiction, it's also an objective contradiction of a movement that's historically disorientated in that sense. But what I want to say is that as long as this left sees its task as revolutionary rather than restorative, I mean restorative in the sense of rebuilding the conditions, for example, for a union movement to thrive, for all these democratic modes of expression to be revived, the left will inevitably set itself the wrong priorities. And sadly enough, the left populist left as we know it today sees its task as revolutionary and not restorative. It sees itself as transcending all these dilemmas which the 20th century supposedly manifested, while at the same time it just is the incarnation of these dilemmas in a different form. So what people now call the PASOKification of the social democratic parties, namely the death of social democracy, is now being followed by so-called Syrizification, or the left's final abdication from the populist moment. And I think the left is today condemned to democracy because it's a question that simply won't go away. You can clearly see that in the attitude a lot of people in the Corbyn movement had towards something like Brexit. It's something they don't really want to deal with. They want to get it out of the way so they can actually enact their program. To them, it's basically a sideshow. They might be in favor of a harder or softer Brexit. There are disagreements within the Corbynite camp on that. but at the same time they think it's not at the center of their political project. They want to do different things. But I think this is exactly the danger, is that they mistake Brexit for a peripheral issue when it is actually a central issue, just as the way that people mistake the Gilets jaunes for a peripheral issue when it is actually a central issue. I think what we are seeing today is people trying to reclaim modes of expression that were still available in the 20th century, even in an authoritarian setting or an integrated setting, but which are completely lost on us today. And this is what I say, is that the left first needs to realize that it's condemned to democracy rather than it choosing to be a democratic force. But that is all I will say on the matter for now. Thank you.
All right, so I found that I read the article by Anton that a lot of that talk was based on prior to coming here. I found it on many issues really very perceptive. I'd like to, I think, there's lots of perceptive observations, but I think that your political conclusions are pretty light. So I'd like to take up with you in the debate kind of your assessment of the Gilets jaunes, what they actually mean in terms of democracy. I'll say a bit about that in my talk, but I think I think do you see the Gilets jaunes as a response to the void, or an antidote to it, an effective antidote to it? Are these people expressing their rage at the experience of the neoliberal destruction of meaningful democracy, or do you actually think that there is something positively restorative in what they're doing? It'd be interesting to have a debate about that. So I'm part of Workers' Liberty. We have a branch in Sheffield. We're a Marxist group. We're active in the Labour Party, in the trade unions, in the student movement. We published absolutely loads of books that you can get up at the front there at the end of the talk. In Sheffield, we meet every Monday. We're very much involved in the campaigning that's going on around defending free movement against the ravages of Brexit. So some people who we work with are going to be holding a stall at 2:00 in town at the town hall this coming Sunday. And our next big public meeting is going to be on transforming the labour movement. We're going to have someone from the PCS, quite a well-established public sector trade union, talking about the attempts to transform that organisation. We're going to get someone from the Deliveroo strikes, which have been spreading around the country, to talk about that as well. And on the 11th of April, we're going to have a sort of a labour movement, climate change activist caucus. So people from across the left and the labour movement who are interested in getting some decent policy out there in labour and trade unions about climate change, come and coordinate. We're going to host a meeting on the 11th, and I'm going to give you Trotskyist chapter and verse on the nature of democracy, so buckle up. And like Anton, I'm going to sort of answer some of Rory's questions, but not all of them. So first of all, democracy absolutely is a regime. Democracy is a class regime. It has a class character. And what I mean by that is not just participation in democratic activity, so voting, turning up to the assembly, what have you, but also subsidiary democratic rights, things like rights to freedom of speech, assembly, free association, and so on, are accorded only to the economically dominant class, to the exploiting class, and to various degrees subordinate classes are excluded from participation and from subsidiary democratic rights. So you think about, I think demagogically, another Greek word, some people refer to Greek democracy, Athenian democracy, as a slave owner's democracy. I think that's a little bit unfair, because on the one hand, it was a democracy for free men, so women and slaves were excluded. Many of the participants were slave owners. In that sense, it was a democratic arrangement amongst exploiters. On the other hand, it was also a blow struck by a broader layer of Greek society against the exclusive power of the aristocracy, the kind of guys who you read about in Homer, whose power has fallen apart by the time that Homer is writing. And Athenian democracy was at once a kind of a plebeian blow struck against those guys and it was a slave owner's democracy. You think about, there's feudal democracies. You can think about democracy with a feudal class character. So you think of the Sejm in Poland, a kind of a House of Lords, where the lords would elect their king, they would pass laws amongst themselves, and they enjoyed a whole bunch of subsidiary democratic rights that they refer to as the golden liberties amongst the Polish aristocracy. You think about capitalist democracy, so the democratic republics in the West, or the British parliamentary democracy, not a republic, alas. They were all born at the start with a property qualification for participation in democracy, and it was over, in Britain's case, several centuries of plebeian and working class struggle that property qualification was struck from the books. And you see the property qualification come and go in France from 1789 with the flowing back and forth of class struggle as the urban and rural poor fight back against the imposition of the categories of active and passive citizens, depending on how rich you are. I think so the property qualification in capitalist democracy has been abolished. It's been abolished by working class struggle. But capitalist democracy remains a class regime. There are what we could call filters on the ability of the working class to participate in democracy. So although there is direct voter suppression, like voter suppression of black voters in the USA, there's a lot of filters whereby the participation of the working class as a disruptive force in capitalist society is blunted. Some of the, if you like, the lines of the last lines of defence against working class incursions into capitalist democracy, you've seen with some headlines over the past few years around Corbyn. So there's been a debate in Tribune magazine recently about the extent to which the civil service will refuse to cooperate with the Corbyn government. You've had various rumblings in the army, most recently from a group of squaddies pulling some social media prank, but also from officers of varying levels of seniority talking about mutinying against the Corbyn government. You've got those big level filters. There are filters at other levels as well. For example, the expense involved in running a successful political campaign. In Britain, the first past the post system. I think what Anton described as the choreography of the French Republic is interesting. At the beginning of the talk, I was looking up a quote by Trotsky, where he's addressing French workers in the previous French Republic in 1934. He says, look, as long as the working class continues on the basis of bourgeois democracy, so as long as you think that the Republican form that you're active in right now is the one, then we will defend it against everyone who wants to degrade it. However, we think that you can go further than this. And he proposes that you should have terms of 2 years for people who are in office, that the legislative and the executive should be the same, that the post of president should be abolished because, in his words, it concentrates the military and all the forces of reaction against the people who are elected. We have that in this country in the sense that the Prime Minister effectively wields the power of the monarch. So, Parliament is run by the Prime Minister, who is the monarch's representative on earth. But in the event of a revolution, or actually a nuclear war, it's the stated policy of the British ruling class that they would reassemble an acceptable government on the basis of calling a quorum of the Privy Council. Furthermore, more radically, deputies should be elected from local assemblies to which they should be accountable and revocable, and they should be on a worker's wage. If you think about the absence of these things, the Chartist called for 1-year terms of office. We don't have that. You've got 5 years in which you can do whatever you please. The idea that the Chartist called for MPs to be paid at all. However, the life of an MP is now very much different from the average life of the people they represent. And so on. And I'll come back to another point about the desirability of popular assemblies as a basis of government, or working class assemblies as a basis of government, when we come on to this question of atomisation and good information. So there's all sorts of ways, there's all sorts of filters that mean that capitalist democracy retains its class character in spite of mass suffrage. And those are contested, and I think that some of Anton's talk was looking at the ways that contestation goes back and forth, and how at the moment we're living in a period where democracy has been very substantially hollowed out. Again, I'm going to come back to that. Socialist democracy will also be a regime. It will be a class regime, absolutely. It'll be a workers' republic. But the social nature of the working class is different in a very important sense, which is that Marx describes the working class as being a universal class that is bound with radical chains. By radical chains, he means that the working class is the victim of wrong in general, that injustice is done to the working class in general. And therefore it is obliged to hit out against injustice in general. The working class is composed of all sectors of humanity. The working class is the most radically diverse social class. The working class it would be inconceivable, for example, for a workers' republic to impose a property qualification for participation, because the entry criterion for being in the working class is precisely that you have nothing. You have nothing to live by apart from the sale of your labour. The working class, unlike the petty exploiting classes that kind of surged forward in the bourgeois revolutions against feudalism, the working class has no subordinate group that it exploits. Now, that's not to say that the working class isn't riven by issues of prejudice, of relative privilege, of all sorts of hangovers of historical bigotry and oppression. For example, the attitudes between men and women, historic attitudes towards sexual minorities, the attitudes of workers in the global north to workers from the global south. There's all sorts of scope for misbehaviour amongst the working class, even under a victorious working class that has erected a workers' republic and done away with private property and the means of production. But there will be no subordinate group which is exploited and needs to be systematically excluded from participation in politics. And so a workers' republic, a socialist republic, will indeed be a regime, but if you like, it'll be the last regime. It'll be the only democratic regime that doesn't systematically exclude a subordinate group. And that's one of the big reasons why it's a great idea and you should all be Trotskyists. So, look, I think there's two fundamentally anti-democratic strains of thought in the labour movement. Sorry, tell me how I'm doing for time. Jab me, I need to start wrapping up.
It's 5-6 minutes.
Okay. There's two fundamentally anti-democratic strains of thought in the labour movement, I think. There's Stalinism and reformism. Stalinism, because it defines socialism as something that's separable from democracy, and reformism because it reduces democracy to a matter of worship of parliament. The two lies feed off each other. The reformists offer a picture of democracy that's manifestly inadequate to solving people's problems, that is, parliament, and parliament only vote once every 5 years. And the Stalinists say that this proves that the lack of democratic rights in either the USSR or whatever their vision of socialism is today is a matter of indifference. It doesn't matter. Look, you're bothered about democracy. Why are you bothered about democracy? There's no democracy in Parliament. Can't you see that that's pointless? So why are you yakking at me about how people don't have the right to go on strike in the Soviet Union or North Korea or whatever? The two lies feed off each other, and they seem to sort of confirm each other. Similarly, there's an idea promoted by both Stalinists and a certain kind of reformist on the one hand, and by anti-communists on the other, which is that socialism really is only economically defined, and it's essentially defined by how much nationalised property you've got, how many things have been nationalised. And the answer to that kind of red herring is the old rhetorical question, which is the whole economy belongs to the state, but who owns the state? The thing about the working class being a democratic class, being defined by people who have no power, no property, the working class can only exercise its rule collectively. It can only exercise its rule through mass participation in democracy. And if it isn't doing that one way or another, then what you've got is not socialism. It contains the basis for exploitation by someone else. And that came to fruition in the Soviet Union, where certainly everything was nationalised, but who owned it? Or in, for example, I think it's Ivory Coast, much post-war history, most of the economy of Ivory Coast was nationalised. But in terms of relations within Ivory Coast and geopolitics of that region, it was very much a capitalist power, capitalist property relations, and it chose its side in the Cold War. So everything might belong to the state, but who does the state belong to? Nationalisation isn't the programme of working class socialism. It's the programme of those administrators, whatever colour their flag, who wish to find themselves in the directors' offices of nationalised industries. Socialism requires democratic control of industry, which may well involve nationalisation, but fundamentally it involves mass self-rule. Democracy isn't just a matter of having the right to vote, which of course everyone has in North Korea. It requires freedom of assembly, timely and accurate information and transparency, regular accountability of elected officers, and a whole host of subsidiary political rights and conditions. And participation in democratic life also has certain material prerequisites. So the working class's struggle for democratic rights in society isn't separable from its struggle for social and economic advances. Any strike immediately throws up a whole load of problems that relate to your democratic rights, your political rights. Again, right of assembly, right to organise, right to speak freely, right to engage in collective bargaining, and to have legal and political representation. So it's a workers' struggle under capitalism is immediately a democratic struggle. It's no coincidence that the formative years of the workers' movements of Europe were heavily concerned with campaigning for the extension of the franchise. So obviously the workers' movement is a very major interest in what goes on in Parliament. And to pretend otherwise, as anarchists and syndicalists do, is to encourage the labour movement to fight with one arm behind its back. And of course, labour opportunists who are lukewarm about strikes want to see the working class fight with its other arm tied behind its back. But the democratic struggle is, I think, fundamental. It's not only about voting rights and other subsidiary political rights. It's also about the greatest unfinished democratic fight, which is the struggle to subordinate the economy to democratic control, to democratise what goes on in the place where you spend 8 hours of every day, which in most people's lives is a dictatorship. The idea that you live in a democratic society where 8 hours of or mostly every day, is spent in a profoundly undemocratic relationship with someone who has power, tremendous power over you, and the weight of the law on their side. That's not a democratic society. So you can see, I think, in the last period. So one point that I want to make is that the social struggle, the economic struggle, and the democratic and political struggle under capitalism, they're the same. And they're also not separable when you're talking about what socialism is. Right? And, for example, one of the things that's happened in the period since 1979, where you could say, the real neoliberal counter-revolution started in earnest, is not only a hollowing out of democracy, hollowing out of local government democracy, hollowing out of participation in elections, of civil society, and Anton's spoken and written about this very eloquently, but going along with that is an increase in inequality. You look at the figures for inequality, you look at wage levels, you look at what's going on with real wages, and that has also fallen. And I think that correlation tells you something about how the social struggle, the economic struggle, and the political struggle are intrinsically linked under capitalism, and you can't really talk about democracy without talking about its class struggle aspect. And there's an important reciprocal relationship between democratic rights in a society and the life of a labour movement. One of the reasons that the fall of the Stalinist states was immediately followed by a neoliberal rampage was that in most Eastern Bloc countries, workers' organisations had been effectively liquidated. They lacked the political and organisational life that you need to be able to defend yourself. Conversely, even the most sort of democratic outcome of the Arab Spring so far has been in Tunisia. You look at the governments and the regimes that have emerged out of the events of 2011, basically it's best in Tunisia. And why is that? It's because unlike these other countries, Tunisia had a legal and genuinely independent trade union movement, the UGTT, and had done more or less since independence. So I suppose I'm hammering this thing about how the class struggle and the democratic struggle are essentially linked. That you can't talk about democracy in the abstract. We can really only talk about democracy and the expansion of democracy for everybody if we're talking about it in terms of the progress, the forward movement of the working class in its struggles against the capitalists. Because that is the thing that is going to democratise the really important part of our society, which is where everyone spends all day at work and what we're working towards. Are we pumping out fossil fuels that are going to destroy the planet, or are we putting up wind turbines and so on and doing something sensible? I think that democracy is always a regime with a class character, and the democratic struggle also must have a class character. So you look at the Gilets jaunes. Sorry, Chair, I'm being extremely abusive and running over here, but
Okay.
roll with it. Yeah. So if the Gilets jaunes is a protest movement about inequality, and their go-to slogan is about democracy. That, it seems to be a sort of tangential thing, but actually it's spot on. It's natural that in a period of neoliberal reaction, where the hollowing out of democracy goes alongside falling real wages and increasing inequality, that people would immediately identify the problem as being a democratic one. It's perfectly sensible. Those things are entwined. Where I think there's a political problem with populist movements like the Gilets jaunes or the Five Star Movement in Italy is that they either ignore or consciously suppress the class character of the democratic struggle. So the chief demands of the Gilets jaunes and the Five Star Movement in Italy are for Switzerland-style referendums. And I don't know if comrades have noticed, but inequality does still exist in Switzerland, where they've been running referendums like that for a long time. So a campaign for democracy that's unhooked from the class struggle, that sees democratic questions as being entirely settled in Parliament and through technical mechanisms is fatally limited. It offers no perspectives for breaking the power of capital for the economy, for spreading democracy through social life, but also it's implicitly corporatist. The idea that we can have a good society without fighting the division of society into classes, the idea that capitalist democracy would work great for absolutely everyone if only we purged some corrupt conspirators who were choreographing things wrong, is actually a similar idea to the politics underpinning the theory that Bush did 9/11. American politics would work great if only it wasn't for these guys who did 9/11. I think, sorry, I've delivered this whole speech in the wrong order, so I have to catch up on where I am. And another problem with the Gilets jaunes and the Five Star Movement is something that's shared with what you could call properly left populist movements around Europe. So the Bernie Sanders campaign run through the Democratic Party, which isn't a party. You can't, I don't know if people know this, you can't rock up in a town in America and go to a meeting of the Democratic Party. It doesn't exist. It just has no meeting.
It's a State Department.
Yeah. Brazil, you want to go to a meeting of the Workers' Party, the PT. Basically, you can't. It does have meetings, but you're sort of discouraged from turning up. And besides, all the decisions are made in this weird online platform as of the early 2000s anyway. France Insoumise, Jean-Luc Mélenchon has gone on record boasting about how we don't have a problem with the membership of France Insoumise because there is no membership. The internal democracy of the party, so-called, is all done online. You look at the internal regime of both the Labour Party and Momentum. The so-called consciously left wing of the Labour Party, is inferior to the internal democracy of the Labour Party. The Labour Party has a delegate conference every year, and the NEC has some power to make decisions in the Labour Party. Momentum, all the decisions are presumably made by online referenda that don't actually ever take place. There are periodically elections, horrendously gerrymandered elections in Momentum to an NCG, a national coordinating group, which has no power to mandate the office staff to do anything. And actually what you get now that's superior to the Gilets jaunes, which don't even have an identifiable office staff, but where everything is run in this kind of plebiscitary manner, where people don't meet each other as equals, where it's not possible really to have a debate. For most people, participation in politics through running your mouth on Facebook is actually a deeply disempowering, atomizing, desperate, demoralizing experience, and not this kind of wonderland of mass participation everyone thinks that it is. there is, I think, the ideology of neoliberalism, the ideology that underpins the way that, for example, 38 Degrees runs itself, has substantially infected not only the Gilets Jaunes, not only the Five Star Movement, but also the so-called left parties of Europe. I think that basically the operating model of the Labour Party under Corbyn remains fundamentally Blairite, although with less expertise in dealing with the press. I think that Momentum conceives of itself, consciously or unconsciously, as essentially being like 38 Degrees. And that is not to say that these guys are all shitbags. It's a political problem, right? It's an outcome of the fact that we've all grown up, all the key players in this thing have grown up, in an era where politics is done by NGOs, it's done by organisations without membership. Anton speaks eloquently about the unhooking of policy from politics. So all these policy organisations do that, and then other people get to have an argument about, you know, how many Stalinists can dance on the head of a pin, and there's no linkage between the two. I'm going to finish with a quote from a motion that Workers' Liberty recently published about democracy and the workers' movement and where we need to get to. Okay, so E.P. Thompson's History, The Making of the English Working Class, reports in the heroic period of the formation of the labour movement in the first half of the 19th century after the Napoleonic Wars, quote, a general addiction to the forms and proprieties of organisational constitutionalism. It seems at times that half a dozen working men could scarcely sit in a room together without appointing a chairman, raising a point of order, or moving the previous question. End quote. Whatever the influences on that addiction of mimicry of bourgeois parliamentarism or of copying from dissenting religious sects, it represented a sound working class instinct and a protection for the critic, for the dissident, the pioneer, the unconfident, the slow of tongue. That tradition remained in force for many decades. In the Blair-Brown period, it was openly decried. Meetings, motions and votes were declared boring and with serious effect. Many young Labour movement people have no idea of the objective procedures needed to make a meeting democratic. Many older ones have lost what idea they did have. And that is one of the various tasks that we set ourselves in Workers' Liberty, something that we want to undo. We want to restore that protection for the slow of tongue, that protection for the minority point of view, for the dissident. We want to restore the idea of the norms of labour movement democracy that prevailed when it was an insurgent movement, building itself in struggle after struggle and victory after victory. We want to get away from the post-Brown, post-Blair NGO ideology of the way that much of the left and the labour movement organises itself today. And that, I think, is why actually there's an extremely profound problem in seeing the Gilets Jaunes as, in any sense, defenders of democracy or restorers of democracy. Anyway, I'm sorry, comrades, I've behaved outrageously. I'm going to shut up now.
Okay, shall we have 3 minutes for both of you to respond to each other, and then it would be then we should get some audience Q&A.
I've had my 3 minutes. So.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think I have that much to disagree with, really. Certainly the last quote about the departure from these kind of what some will call like bourgeois proceduralism almost, and how that has declined. I think the 2 points I want to make is that what we see in the Corbyn left, or what can explain the Corbyn left, is that it's both a reaction but also a product of Blairism. So they inevitably consolidate parts of the Blairite era while trying to supersede and transcend other parts of it. So I think the fact that it's a very media-centric, discourse-oriented movement speaks to the fact that they're also products of a certain Blairite mentality and a Blairite ethos, and they're not escaping it. So they're the children of the void, and they try to negotiate the void in a very different way, but it doesn't mean that they've been conditioned by the void in a very thorough sense. And the other point I want to make is something like the claim we need more democracy within the workers' movement. To me, I wouldn't say it sounds oxymoronic, but to me there is no real workers' movement. There is no real institutional or sort of societal presence for the workers' movement. The workers' movement, or the working class, remains disorganized to the utmost degree. And that's why I'm holding this kind of moderate plea for the restoration of some, might say, principles of bourgeois democracy. Almost in the spirit of Trotsky in 1934, where he said, like, we will defend this system which is incomplete, which is still, like, hugely superior to fascist or ancien regime modes of governance. But I think what has happened since 1934 is we've now attained a bourgeoisie which is just not confident to rule, which has gone back on a lot of its initial promises. And because it has no real opponent anymore, it's degenerated because what the workers' movement did was not only prepare itself for revolution, it also disciplined and trained its opponent. The ruling class had to maintain a degree of discipline when confronted with this powerful an opponent. And what happened in the 1970s and 1980s is Thatcher not only destroyed the union movement, she also wiped away that whole civil society of conservative institutions which naturally buttressed something like the Conservative Party. So even a Conservative Party is now a sort of, it's a small sect basically beholden to spin doctors in that sense. It's demoralized, it's intensely without inspiration. That doesn't mean that British capital doesn't have a confident defender in it, but it's a bourgeoisie that doesn't believe in itself. And that doesn't even, I mean, it's hugely anti-parliamentary. The whole way the European Union is set up is to disempower parliaments and to empower executives in that way. And I think what rebuilding a working class movement means now, I mean, this is a difficult question of priority, like where do you start with so many voids shifting around in that way. But it would mean at least reconstructing a working class presence and allowing the kind of environment in which this working class presence can thrive. And I think just reclaiming some of this bourgeois democratic tradition is very important for that. And what you described at the end of the emotion seems an important part of that, but I think it needs to go, needs to go deeper. The task is really restorative. I don't think anything remotely revolutionary is on the table here. I think the only minimal thing that can be done is to restore some basic preconditions for democratic or for working class organizing in that way.
Okay. Right, well, we'll open up the Q&A. So if anyone wants to ask a question or make some kind of point, put your hand up and try and get my attention. I'm sure you'll stick out like a sore thumb. Yeah,
so that's more on sort of the aspects of the populist left, especially in terms of rhetoric, and how it's just completely been lost in Britain, especially around Brexit. But you saw the article in the New Statesman today, sort of concerning Paul Mason and how he goes around discussing sort of the mainstream left sort of figures and discussions around how sort of the basket of deplorables, each person who voted for Brexit was an immigrant here instead of and how the left has lost Brexit. And we should have been having a drive with that to be able to obviously take control of the narrative of Brexit. And we've just handed it over to the far right to be able to take control of the discourse. And that sort of, whilst there's sort of great theorising behind all things, it's going to be the ultimate goal. You've still got to get people on board and get people across. And we've been terrible at actually connecting with people in the centre and terrible at connecting to people on those fringes in the meantime. So it's just sort of your opinions on how we can reclaim that sort of softer language and being able to draw people into sort of leftist theory.
I mean, I have my thoughts on this, but maybe I'll let you go first.
I would prefer it if we kind of took a round of questions.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I don't think we should do question stacking. I think it would be better to have like every individual kind of concern addressed individually.
Right.
Do you want me to start, or do you want to start?
You go first.
I think Mason is really also an interesting symptom of the kind of degeneration that parts of the left have experienced, because he's obviously lost his mind. I think when he saw, I think he was in Greece with Syriza, and he has a kind of Medusa effect or Stockholm syndrome or something like the European Union, because he saw the beast, and the beast looked at him and it turned him into stone, and now he's become the most eloquent defender of this institution. And I think, I don't think there's a socialist case for Brexit in that sense, because there is no working class presence that can see something like Brexit. I don't think it exists. So this is where that letter that was published in the New Statesman today, which criticizes Mason, I disagree with some points of it, but I just disagree with the idea that there's a socialist case to be made, because there's no real socialist presence that I can actually see at this kind of moment. Where I do agree is that the left, as I said, has abdicated, has completely squandered its opportunity, or the winner opportunity which is offered around Brexit. Because I do think that leaving the European Union would be a way to restore some of these formal principles of democracy, which have been eroded around the continent precisely through something like the European Union. And this is not to say I'm not a fetishist for parliamentary sovereignty. I agree there are hugely reactionary arguments for parliamentary sovereignty. In the 1920s, during the general strike in Britain, this was the rhetoric used by Tories such as Stanley Baldwin, is do you believe Parliament or do you believe these terrorists who are striking out there? So there is a really reactionary argument for parliamentary sovereignty. But we're not in the 1920s, and there's not a mass workers' movement out there that can hold general strikes. And for a lot of people, something like a plebiscite on membership of this transnational institution is the only way to still express a democratic voice. And the fact that Parliament can't carry out Brexit just shows the erosion of bourgeois democratic rights in that way. And I'm not saying that it's there's not a Nazi side, because Brexit is just a formal issue. It's what you make of it. I'm not saying there's a potentially very, very painful and dangerous consequence to this. But clearly the response to the left had been just let it tumble into the abyss. It'll be over, whatever deal passes, even if it doesn't pass. We don't want to be associated with it. We don't want to be seen as the people who actually execute Brexit. But we also don't want to be seen as the people who thwart the people's will in that sense. So it's striking a very difficult middle way. But I think that just pays testimony to their own helplessness in the sense of they were unprepared for it, just as Mélenchon is unprepared for the Gilets jaunes. Because his reaction to the Gilets jaunes is like, yeah, great, we'll put these people in my party and they'll be they'll be in handy electoral herd for my next presidential election, basically. But these people don't want to inscribe themselves into the institutional structures of Mélenchon because they walk around with banners that say no parties, no parliaments, no mediation, basically. And I mean, this is the only point I say. Like, I am a moderate supporter of Brexit because I think it will make for severe annulation not only of parliamentary but also popular sovereignty if it doesn't go through. But I think the case to be made for it is purely formal and not substantive. I don't think anyone should fool themselves to think there is a socialist case for Brexit in that sense. But as I say, seizing the momentum, seizing the opportunity, I mean, if you mean that a very small clique of London leftists does it, or if it's a very small section of the Labour Party does it, yeah, you could call that seizing, but it's not like a sort of working class arising precisely because of the fact that Brexit happened in that way.
I think that you're both wrong on all counts. I think we should stop Brexit, basically. And I don't much mind how it's done. But I think that tactically another referendum is probably the best way of going about it, or Labour winning an election on a Remain platform. So first of all, I agree with Anton that you can't capture the narrative. I think people talk about let's capture the narrative, and I think that is left-wing people accidentally finding themselves falling into the patterns of thought of an Alistair Campbell type figure, right? So you capture the narrative. What does that even mean? I think where Anton's right to say that, but I think, Anton, you've said explicitly that you essentially regard Brexit as an empty vessel, as a matter of form that's without substance. And I think that that's to make the same error as the person who says, let's capture the narrative. Brexit is not an empty vessel into which you can pour whatever political substance you want. It has a substance of its own, which is Brexit was basically it was a referendum on nationalism, and the political effect of Brexit will be to confirm the politics of the nationalist right. In the very short term, it might cause the Tory party or UKIP or whoever to suffer an internal crisis. Fine, popcorn, sure, but actually it will confirm nationalist prejudices, not only in Britain but around the world. Remember Trump saying shortly before his election, we're going to be like Brexit times 10. Right? Brexit's a right-wing phenomenon. And I think that the reason... I don't think that we should have, the attitude of elitist bourgeois Remain types who say, fuck everyone who voted Leave. I do think, however, that being able to construct something means being able to swim against the stream. If you think about the heroic period of the Labour movement, there were actually lots of points at which that Labour movement, in order to construct itself, had to do something that was unpopular. And I think we have to be prepared to do that. And actually, I think that no one will respect us if we don't. Right? And if you look at the most vigorous part of the British Labour movement that is most aggressively fighting capitalists and organising new sectors, very small trade union, the IWGB, their position is stop Brexit, and it has been for quite a while now. Right? So I think that we should... very briefly, Brexit means the end of freedom of movement. It doesn't mean the end of immigration into Britain, but it means a severe curtailment of rights of people who come to live in Britain. Both Labour and the Tories say that your rights to live in this country after Brexit will be dependent upon your employment status, unless you're very rich. What that means is, if you join a trade union, your boss can not just sack you or be annoyed or whatever. They can deport you. They can refuse to renew your contract and have you deported, essentially, if you join a trade union. What is that going to do to our project of rebuilding the workers' movement? It's going to really fuck it up. I was speaking to someone who works for Usdaw recently. Usdaw organises people who work in Tesco's and other big retail outlets. I said, what's the effect of Brexit? She said, well, look, it's actually been really bad because now half our members think the other half want to have them kicked out of the country. Right? This is bad stuff, man. And I think that, if you think that you can seize that narrative and turn it into something left-wing or turn it to our advantage or strengthen democracy, keep off the crack.
First of all, I'd just like to say that I agree with you absolutely about that aspect. But there was something in your video, Anton, which struck me very fresh in thinking, which I've not come across before for a long while, because I'm in a discussion with people on the traditional British left who are very conservative in their thinking in extremes. Heartbreaking sometimes. Like you said, it took the British left by surprise what happened with the Brexit vote. As if, and all of a sudden we get people saying, we don't want to talk about that, but let's talk about what we really want to talk about, which is how we can get socialism to the core of the government. And this Brexit, as you said in your introduction, is actually central to what's going off in real politics. So I don't think it's a case of we can shut it off to one side or be neutral on our decisions. So I do agree with you on that. We've stopped touring Brexit as being the right campaign for some time. But what you said about the disconnection of the British left from the reality of politics, pretending it will go away if we just, I don't know, do what, carry on with business as usual. And it shows the conservatism of the British left thinking, which has re-emerged with the resurgence of the mountain. It's not a new movement, in my experience. I'm old enough to remember the old campaign for Labour Party democracy in the early 1980s. It's the same thing, sort of, in a sense, but the traditions of the British left, as you quite rightly say, are rooted in things like reformism and Stalinism. They're not going to, and they've been blocked to progressive politics for the last 30, 40 years in my time, which is why I dropped out. They really are. But this is not a very. I'm trying to find something positive to say. Momentum are, unfortunately, I've been trying, as Andrew identified, I've been trying to have discussions with our friends in the Marxist Society here, who seem linked to the idea that they've got this movement we call momentum, and everything's going swimmingly, the next thing's get called. Anybody who talks about the problem of Brexit is an enemy of the people. This is their attitude, because you're just talking about the People's Vote campaign, which my union, the musician union, supports. The executive supported it, not rank and file. It is but it's the traditional left thinking. All right, we can identify with a couple of hundred people demonstrating to defend the workers' jobs at Honda car factory. We understand that. That's traditional British left syndicalism. A couple of hundred demonstrators. Yet 1 million people were out in the street last Saturday demonstrating against Brexit. There had no intervention. What I call the democratic left in Britain, the Socialist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Communist Party with their horrible line about people's Brexit, whatever else that means, and the Socialist Party for a workers' Brexit. It's all, or even Stephen Kinnock with his Norway Plus, it's all schemeless. They're ignoring a real movement which is going on in the street. 1 million people on the street, and that's not real. A couple of hundred people demonstrate, defend jobs are important, certainly. But my experience of the trade union left is they've been a roadblock to development of progressive politics for 30 or 40 years. We know this. And it breaks my heart to say it, but they are a roadblock. People like Len McCluskey, today, good supporter of Corbyn, but his thinking is so stuck in a paradigm which is, they're living in a false paradise. We've got this Labour Party now, which is growing. I think this is great. we've got the best socialist party in Europe. Everybody else is going into decline, the German SPD, the French socialists, the French communists, they're all out. But we're growing because we're the Labour Party in Britain. We're so great, we're so good. We've got extremely conservative ideas, and it's all going to fall apart. And I tend to agree with you, Anton. There is still mileage in the need to defend democratic institutions like Parliament against fascists, and that's not to be forgotten. One of the tragedies, which is a long historical discussion, one of the tragedies of the left in Europe in the 1930s was the failure of the socialists and the radicals to develop a progressive alliance in the face of fascism. That's another subject. But the conservatism of the British left is so frustrating at the moment. I don't even know where to begin. Except to say good luck to you, and I'll come on to your next meeting.
Does anyone want to respond with words?
Do you have something?
Something substantive? No, I think there's one thing that I'd pull out of that, which is this thing about enforced optimism. It's something you get with the SWP as well. You go along to an SWP meeting, and there's this kind of mandated optimism. Everyone in my workplace is very angry. The situation is excellent, and I think that you get a bit of that with people on the British left who've decided that they're going to make themselves Jeremy Corbyn's shop stewards. So, Socialist Appeal, for example, the old militant tendency, they've decided that their job in the movement is just to say that everything's fantastic about Corbyn. I think that you get that with other people as well, like Navarra, and certainly I campaigned for Corbyn twice. I speak up in defence of the left leadership in my Labour Party ward. I set up Haringey Momentum, but we've got to be prepared to be critical as well. And I think that this thing of everything is always wonderful is a bit of a hangover from Blairite forms of communication and or Stalinist forms of communication. The Blairites all learned their chops in the Communist Party. It ain't good.
Again, I don't think I have that much to add to it. I just think my sort of purely formal defense of Brexit obviously doesn't entail an end to something like free movement in that sense. So I definitely think that there's a reason for resisting modes of Brexit. And it's not just about capturing the narrative, but I think, to take the example of something like the People's March, People's March is not a mass strike. It's not like workers seizing industries. It's not a complete shutdown of production. It's on a Saturday, which is not in the work week. I mean, there are people that also work on a Saturday, of course, and these people didn't show up in London at that time. The class composition of that march is very interesting because apparently it is like quite middle class, and to me there's a sense in which not carrying out Brexit means thereby denying the fact that Parliament delegated its power to a plebiscite in a referendum, in a pragmatic sense, will be incredibly dangerous because it will leave behind such a toxic legacy for 30 years. And I'm not saying there are variants of Brexit that will also not be highly toxic, certainly if they entail an end to free movement. But what the European Union has done across Europe, but also in Britain, but in a less direct sense, is that it's covered up this void. The European Union offers European elites to actually pretend as if there's not this void that's been grown between society and the state in that way. And what you see in Britain is Britain didn't need the European Union that explicitly, like France, for example, because the way Thatcher crushed the working class was almost directly military in the 1980s. It's just by sending policemen or military north and crushing the miners. So the European, you didn't need these kind of constitutional restrictions that have been used in all these European member states to actually quash working class revolt and destroy working class institutions. While what Thatcher did, and because she had a very potent parliament at her disposal, is that she did this through a very direct way. But what has happened in other European member states is that the European Union has gradually built this kind of cage around democratic politics all across the continent. And this has basically happened through people signing treaties, and then there are referendums on these treaties, but these referendums are denied. And if you look at what happened in Europe after all these referendums were held on these different European treaties, is that the legacy of them negating or deciding not to carry out these referendum results has been highly, highly toxic. And it's poisoned politics for a generation, which you can see in France now. And I think you cannot understand Macron's response to something like the Gilets jaunes which is open repression, which even leads to some human rights NGOs worrying about the state of police repression in France, because he's part of a generation that just is used to not operating with the democratic mandate. It's almost a sort of pre-democratic form of bourgeois rule, where there's not even a need to get any kind of electoral fiat or electoral mandate on behalf of what you're doing. And my reason for Brexit is just, in this sense, pragmatic. It's like, don't go down that road, because what you're creating is an even more toxic legacy.
Can I just come back on that one point? Because I was on the demonstration the other week, and I spoke to our MP, Paul Blomfield, whose wife, Linda, who was an MEP, who were on that march. And he said he was going on about all these schemas, you know, like how we can get a softer Brexit. And this tends to be the view of the social faction, which I used to be supporter of, which has the ear of some people of the Labour movement. We need to go for a soft Brexit and come up with these different schemas. I said, well, the problem with all these schemas is, as you say, the democratic narrative is effectively stolen, I'll put it this way, by Nigel Farage. Anything you do to reverse that now has to be confirmed, and I think this is a political question, which is why I think that the idea of the people's vote is correct at this point, because the choice will come down to approve the Brexit deal which has been negotiated for remaining in the European Union, and that will be the decision. Now that's the way to get back the democrat. You do this about the phrase, the democratic narrative. But I think that's what really happened with Nigel Farage. And I think it's dangerous, as you say, for the Labour movement amongst the working class when they say things like, they're so disengaged with politics that it would, to the extent where people say, well, we'll go for no deal. And what does that mean? It's a deal. It's no deal. Oh, it's like these people on these sick websites, self-harm websites, where they go on, do it, kill you. And it's sick. It's sick. They are. This kind of disengagement of people from real politics. And just if I just may, to emphasise the other point I was making about the thinking of the British left, the SNP, the Communist Party, all the rest of them, has been so rooted in militant syndicalism. Coming back to what you said about the miners' strike, I remember the miners' strike. I was involved with that in Nottingham. But the thinking of the left was so tied up with militant syndicalism for a whole period, we couldn't see what was behind that. So the method became talk left, we talk militant, we talk left. And then we were forced to capitulate totally. So it's talk left, capitulate, which has been the method of reforms since the days of Ramsay MacDonald, for goodness sake. And I think we should look, we're not too proud to look at the experience of the European left. I mean, I come from the tradition of Ernest Mandel, Fourth International, and the bottom line for him in his book, From Stalinism to Euro-Communism, which is a book still to be read, maybe. It was written 40 years ago, and the subtitle is the bitter end of socialism in one country. And the bottom line for Mandel was always United Socialist States of Europe, and I don't believe that we're going to get 1 inch closer to it by coming out of the European Union, whichever way you cut it. So I'm with you on that one.
Yeah. Is there anyone else in the audience who has?
Yeah, if we have time, I'll ask a question. I think it was Anton you alluded to the slogans that the Gilets Jaunes have got on their vests. And I mean, I was going to ask a question earlier about whether it even makes sense to talk about the demands of the Gilets Jaunes, given that there's such a heterogeneous kind of grab bag of people, and it's very varied depending on the region and whatever. But I was just going to ask you, how prevalent do you think this kind of anti-political sentiment is, like scepticism about politics as such, and if it does exist, how do you deal with that? Because it seems like whilst in some sense it could be the case that, oh, we do need to rebuild civil society institutions, we need to create parties that are responsive to their mass bases, but we're so far away from that, and it does seem like there is a real anti-political sentiment. So how do we deal with that? Because it seems quite glib to go up to people and just say, oh, you just need a party that will properly represent you. You know, when white people are lashing out in these ways, and that are actually, I mean, personally, I find quite exciting, and I'm sure like it's probably more exciting than anything I've ever done in my life. So yeah. I'm talking about Jäger mainly, and I suppose, I mean, in some sense, I don't know if that's even a mass movement. Like, there are actually, I think, less people turning up to those demonstrations than, trade union demonstrations in the last 10 years or so would get in France. So, I mean, there's also this question of do the masses even exist at this point in history?
I think, like, I tend to agree with you. There's something refreshing about it, that at least they expose the void, or they at least expose the fact that the repertoire of political action has become so narrow. So even if it's riots on a Saturday, it's again a Saturday, it's not during the working week. This is another important point, is that it's very much political and not necessarily a social struggle, as you point out as well. Which is refreshing because it at least rests on a realization that there's something profoundly wrong with even the way some people perceive politics in the first place. So I think there are two classical examples on what you could call the sort of established online left as well, to the Gilets jaunes. It's either a sort of, there are three attempts, I think. Either parties, which are instead of pseudo parties, come along and just try to recuperate them, which is Mélenchon's tactic, which doesn't really work because these people are obviously not interested in inscribing themselves into his institution. The second is then just to say, oh, they're infested with fascists, they're infested with far-right elements, so we shouldn't associate with them. They're all white workers anyway, and if non-native born Frenchmen were doing this, they would be pummeled by the police immediately, so we don't want anything to do with this movement.
Yeah, it's even spread to, I don't know how to pronounce it, reunion. So that one.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, it doesn't make sense. Like, it's not an exclusively white movement, but this is a narrative that's now being spun out. And then the final one is a sort of empty celebration of spontaneity, where you have, I mean, something like Commune Mag in America, or some other tenants, which is like, oh my God, this is great, because it's this denial of mediation, and they reject all institutions. This is the kind of social struggle we need for the 21st century after the disasters or the wreckages of the 20th. And I think all of those three responses just exemplify helplessness, because they all just expose the fact that they don't really have any social control over this movement. And like the response to the third one is just like, it's not necessarily a social movement. As I say, it happens on a Saturday, and all these people just go to work on Monday, so there's no disruption of production. It's mainly disruption of circulation, as they themselves say. It's not clear that it's only a fascist movement, so that feeling is wrong. And it's not clear that these people want to be in a party in that way. But I think the most valuable thing to do is to read it as a psychoanalyst would do, as a symptom. And you have to work through it as a symptom, which means that you actually have to recognize the kind of suffering and the kind of grievances that underlie this kind of expression. But then the choice just shouldn't be like, oh, celebrate it as something that's intrinsically good, or paternalistically trying to claim the movement. But say, like, if you engage in a dialogue with that movement, you can say, like, look, we can understand that this is the point of action we want to take now, but we do want to point out limits. Like, if you demonstrate on Saturdays, there's a chance you might not actually disrupt the course of social events in France that thoroughly. And actually pointing out the limits of something like a Gilets jaunes approach might, to me, be a more valuable attempt than just either complete affirmation, complete negation, or recuperation, as we've seen it now. And I can't say I have like a ready-made model on how this dialogue should happen, but at least I think there needs to be a more thorough engagement rather than like top-down claims or just bottom-up celebrations. Like, ooh, this is great, yeah, smash all the stores, do whatever you want.
I suppose the point was just like, I feel like that anti-political sentiment does need to be taken seriously.
Exactly, yeah. I agree. Yeah.
So you got this anti-political sentiment, like no parties, right? But politics is still going on. So the Gilets jaunes aren't new. They're sort of new in that they're like, there are some features of them that are a bit different, but there have been loads of movements like this in recent history in Europe. So you had the Indignados in Spain, very anti-political occupations of squares. You know, they're not doing like rad stuff like destroying posh restaurants or picketing roundabouts, but right, there's something very similar, right? It's anti-political, no parties please. The demands, insofar as there are demands, they're quite similar. It's a sort of reflexive. Problem is, we don't have democracy. What we want is real democracy. And, you know, these politicians are all corrupt, and that's why I'm poor. And that's basically right as well. But there's a lot missing there, and a lot of the detail of what's going on is important. So you had the Indignados in Spain, you had the Agonactis mainly in Greece, same deal, occupied Syntagma Square. You had the Pitchfork people in Italy, and you had sort of the Occupy movement in the States, but that wasn't very good. Actually, look, you think about it, the Arab Spring has a lot of these. There's a lot of crossovers, and indeed, probably oddly, the biggest percentage of the population Arab Spring thing that happened was in fact in Israel, where there was a gigantic movement for the welfare state. But I'm just thinking about Italy and Greece, the two forerunners, right? So you've got in a small country probably something like 1 million people participate in the occupation of Syntagma Square, and there it's all Greek flags, it's all no parties please, it's all talk about democracy. But then, you know, what happens next is the next stage in the struggle is that there are 35 general strikes, and then absolutely loads of people join and or vote for Syriza and set up popular assemblies. Now we can talk about what happened next in the sense that they got beaten, they lost. But what that shows is, look, they say that it's anti-political, they say no parties please, but what's going on in those squares is politics. Politics is still happening there, whether you like it or not, and whether people admit it or not. And the reason that Syriza did quite well out of that in the long run is they had a load of people who went along and spent a long time there talking to people about politics on a level. Right? Same thing with the Indignados movement and who's it? Pablo Iglesias' lot. Podemos. And presumably, you know, the same stuff is happening amongst the Gilets jaunes. So politics is happening, even if they say it's not. Oh, sorry, I forgot Italy. The Pitchforks movement, kind of anti-political. It's politics sort of driven by this atomized online sphere where all the political stuff that's actually going on is being discussed on Facebook and stuff, or online vote platforms, and you get the Five Star Movement, which is now in coalition with a serious far-right formation, and the far-right, the Five Star Movement has got a lot of anti-immigrant politics of its own. So you can go either way. I think there is a real danger. I don't agree, I agree with what Anton says about, you know, there are some people who say you can't touch it because it's all fascist and it's all white, and I don't agree with that. There are some people who just like, you know, just clap along like seals, you know, they give it their seal of approval. They're wrong too. What I would say about it is politics is going on. There are a lot of characteristics about the Gilets jaunes movement which, in my view, are sending it towards the formation of some kind of Beppe Grillo 5-star, we're not political, but actually we're really right-wing sort of formation. You could also see a left-wing formation winning big out of it. Let's take an example. In Lille, the local trade unions have done a lot of work with engaging with the Gilets jaunes, and you've got joint Gilets jaunes trade union communiques going out and campaigning around workers' rights and doing workplace stuff. I know that Trotskyists on the railways in the Parisian region, people in a group called Étincelle, have been doing a lot of work getting their colleagues on the rails to go to Gilets jaunes things and engage with people and talk with people. Belatedly, the CGT joined those demonstrations and started trying to talk politics. Lutte Ouvrière, the biggest Trotskyist organisation in France and possibly in Europe, has also been doing some good stuff, going and talking to people. So politics is going on whether you want it to be or not, I think, is kind of the thing I'd say. And what can we do? Basically go and talk to people. Now, on the other hand, show, don't tell. Like, one of the features of the Gilets jaunes movement, right, is small shopkeepers are closing down their shops on the days of the demonstrations and docking their staff's pay, or using the fact that they employ these people to oblige them to go on the demonstrations. some of the demands that are coming out of Gilets Jaunes internet forums or assemblies are very much to do with protect small business, right? So, and indeed, there's an organisation of farmers, I think, that road hauliers cut off their support for the movement after they started being too disruptive. So there's a class struggle going on in the middle of that as well. And I think one thing that we want to see, more class struggle in France, more workers fighting their bosses and being able to show these provincial workers who are not organised in the labour movement, that there is a path of struggle that they can take that will improve their lives, that doesn't involve basically being pushed around by the local cafe owner or the local publican into getting involved with his stuff. So there's a class divide in the Gilets Jaunes movement, and we should push on that. But again, you've got to show, not tell. And you've also got to tell, you and turn up and talk to people that sensitively and persistently.
Okay, I might cash in my moderator chips and ask my own question. So I think like one of the perhaps one of the differences between what like both of your perspectives is on this question of the relationship between democracy and the class struggle. So Anton, you mentioned the fact that today it seems that we're kind of condemned to the struggle for democracy as opposed to like the battle of democracy in the kind of Marx sense. And I guess like it does kind of bring up some historical stuff as well. I mean, we talked a lot about like the 20th century, but there's a way in which like the 20th, what happens in the 20th century is a kind of degraded repetition of the 19th century. So I guess like I guess it brings. You both like mentioned Trotsky as well, so I thought I'd throw some Trotsky in. His kind of evaluation of like the 19th century revolutions in the 1900s, when he's kind of talking about like the French Revolution, and has this kind of argument that at that point like the nation state and like I guess what you would call the bourgeois revolutions were kind of adequate to make the revolution and kind of follow through on it, but whereas by 1848 that's not the case. And there's a kind of, I guess, emerging crisis of democracy, to which like Marx's response is like, yeah, the political independence of the working class, building international socialist organisations. I guess if we're going to like properly think about democracy in the left today, perhaps like a kind of an account of like why there's no political subject in the same way is like perhaps worth bringing up, because like whereas like Marxism kind of responded to this crisis in a particular way, that seems like less available or clear as an option today. So I guess like if we're trying to think about like what would it mean to get out of this sort of like post-political stupor, what would it take to kind of reconstitute an actual political subject in that sense?
I think like the paradox I try to identify, which you identified here more elegantly, is that there's now a struggle for democracy. So there's a battle for democracy, not battle of democracy going on, but not in the concept of an undemocratic ancien regime. So this is the paradox of post-democracy, is that there was a 20th century in which this struggle for democracy was won, but the battle of democracy was not won, certainly not by communist forces. And we're now in a period again in which the struggle for democracy, I think, needs to happen again, but is also happening again. But there is no, there's no ancien regime to demolish, basically. I think this explains our contemporary confusion, is because the kind of forces you're facing are don't have the same kind of historical weight as you saw in the 19th century. So what Marx's relationship to the democratic struggle in the 19th century was, okay, this is a struggle that needs to be waged, suffrage needs to be generalized, but once this political struggle is won, it's clear that democracy won't live up to its promises, and then the social struggle will commence, and political emancipation and social emancipation will happen together. But I think what we've seen now is that we're back at square one, almost in a sense. The only difference is now that we have a form of court politics, we have a highly sort of secretive form of international diplomacy, all these things that remind us of the pre-1914 situation. but at the same time, you can't mobilize the same rhetoric. I mean, I'd almost say you can't mobilize the same kind of populist rhetoric to actually make that case for democracy in that sense again. So what Brexit and Trump are doing is that they're changing capitalism much quicker than the left, or it's outpaced the left in a very intensive sense. But the left just can't recourse to that old democratic vocabulary to buttress his claim in that way. So this, I think, just explains a really profound historical disorientation where you don't know how to actually take on this problem.
Maybe one way of posing the same question to you would be is it you mentioned class struggle and democracy being kind of holistically intertwined, I suppose. But I guess could we kind of conceivably talk of democracy without the class struggle, or vice versa?
Yes, but it would be wrong. Right, so there are people who talk about why is it that people who only ever talk about proportional representation are so annoying? Right, well, what is it that makes those people just so kind of irritating? Exactly that. It sort of. I often find myself gripped by an inarticulate rage when I encounter someone who their main issue in life is getting rid of first past the post. Because I agree with them. They're right. Yeah, there's lots of things that you could do to make Parliament a lot better. But if that is all that you've got to say about the fight for democracy in our society, then that is not good. I think that on the other hand, right, there's this quote that sums up, I think, the kind of anti-democratic idea that the Stalinists have. So Stalin gets up on his hind legs one day and he says, I can't imagine what democratic freedoms are enjoyed by someone who's sleeping under a bridge and doesn't have enough to eat. And that's sort of unanswerable, isn't it? But actually that's wrong as well, because democratic rights matter. A democratic regime and a democratic spirit within our movement matters. Dictatorships where you can't have a meeting like the one we're having now are not socialist. And a socialist society is defined by the power of the working class within it, not by the percentage of the economy that's nationalised. So, you want to talk about the battle for democracy. Yes, we're extremely bothered about constitutional questions. We're extremely bothered about the presence of priests in our legislature. There are all sorts of demands that we might raise. We need a republic. We want to abolish that concentration of the powers of reaction in the person of the Queen, which in turn concentrates state power in the hands of the Prime Minister in a way that overrides the rule of Parliament. We're bothered about terms of office. We're bothered about the non-recallability of MPs. We're bothered about first past the post. We're bothered about the House of Lords. Bothered about all of those things. But actually, when you really get down to it, the thing that would make society that much more democratic is the resurrection of serious class struggle, the resurrection of the working class as a force for itself. And there's other things that I didn't mention as well. For example, restoring local government. You should all vote Labour on the 2nd of May. But beyond quite a limited point, it doesn't matter that much what happens in local government, because it's going to implement spending cuts. Thanks to what the Lib Dems did, local government is bound by PFI contracts. Half the stuff that the bloody council does is outsourced anyway. And actually, that's another thing. I'll get onto this right at the end. Look, I think the fundamental thing that you need to do is to, with a democratic spirit, wage the class struggle in politics and in the economy. What can we do to restore a collective subject, as Rory said, or in other words, what can the socialist movement do to get back in the game? Well, to get back in the game, we need to rebuild industrial organisations. We need to rebuild community organisations. That means taking the organs of the Labour Party. In my ward, right, there are thousands of Labour Party members, hundreds at least, of Labour Party members who are under the age of 35. And they never turn up to meetings, no one ever bothers calling them. They've joined so that they can do things like vote for Jeremy online or whatever, but they don't. You need to turn that around and make attending Labour Party meetings part of a collective and empowering and educating culture that also puts you in the front line of the class struggle. Acorn, I think, is something that we should build, a tenant and tenants union, something that's serious, it's going places. We should organise workers. Here at the university, you guys have just won a fight with student union management over the people who work at the bar. But actually, most people here, I believe, even though it's Sheffield University, have got jobs, right? Well, we should be organising them. And I think the reason I'm more optimistic, I think, overall than Anton, is the class struggle doesn't proceed in a linear manner, right? Once something... People are realistic. Everyone's pissed off. The stuff we're talking about, the hollowing out of democracy, it's not like no one's noticed. Of course everyone's noticed. Of course everyone knows that their real wages have been falling for so long. People don't get involved until they can see something which is offering them a plausible chance of making a difference. Once something actually gets motoring, people want to get involved. And so the development of the workers' movement is non-linear. The development of the struggle is non-linear. If we can build something that people look at and say, yes, I can see how getting involved in that is going to help me, then things could take off rather faster. And I think that, as with Lenin in 1917, sometimes you jump stages. I should plug this as well. It's a campaign to repeal the anti-trade union laws. In France, if you want to go on strike, you just do it. You don't need to be a member of the union. There's no ballot required. There's a small amount of bureaucratic stuff. In this country, it takes nearly a month from lodging a grievance in the first place to actually taking action. And there's all sorts of subsidiary laws that get in the way, things that can mean that a union can be fined if people don't pick it in exactly the right way, and so on, that stymies and wrecks disputes. I was involved in the Picture House strikes, cinema workers' strikes last year, and they were absolutely ravaged by these anti-trade union laws. I think that's a major democratic fight that we need to have in this country right now. There's a little bit of stuff. Basically, I want to shout at Anton for a bit about Brexit, because I think he's being unfair to his own analysis of neoliberalism when he says that the European Union is... When he says that the European Union is at fault for doing in democracy all across the continent, I think that Anton is being radically unfair to the depth and sophistication of his own analysis of neoliberalism to blame it on the EU SSR. I think that's some Captain Mannering stuff. I think it's wrong, but maybe we can do all that shouting in the pub.
All right, well, we've got another minute, so Anton, if you have anything to say, just as last words.
No, absolutely agree. I mean, it's just the question of putting the cart before the horse. And I think revitalizing democratic institutions will be done by class struggle, but I mean, it's undeniable that repealing something like the union laws is only something a parliamentary force can do.
Yes.
So it's a very explicit argument for electing a Labour government, because you can't actually get unions to organise a campaign to repeal the laws which make possible their organising in the same place. It's a sort of vicious circularity in that way. And this is a very concrete example of something that I think would allow for a reflourishing or rebuilding of these kind of institutional structures that have gone. But I do think, on the question of the European Union, this is obviously a really big topic, but I think the European Union is both a symptom but also a cause of the hollowing out of a lot of these institutions. And it has not facilitated greater working class action in many ways. Maybe it's a cultural thing, because Europeans are irrationally attached to certain forms of national identity, but the European Union is not a very hospitable platform for transnational organizing, precisely because it's constructed in such a way as if there's no real state to seize. It hasn't created a public sphere because it was not designed in such a way. It's designed to be irreformable, but it's also designed to be a non-state, in the sense that you can't really capture it in a Leninist way. And I think it's a very, very tricky institution, because it's the neoliberal dream, because it has a lot of political power, executive power. But unlike these kind of bourgeois states of the late 19th century, it doesn't allow for the working classes to actually seize it in any significant way. It's mainly a sort of sphere in which national elites retreat and make decisions they don't want to push through their national parliaments. And I think coming to terms with what the European Union actually is, and what its potentially progressive promises might be, is actually the first task, because there's no real ontology of the European Union today. The European Union is often a sort of proxy for a lot of national questions in that way. And this is probably something for the pub, I'd say. But I don't want to commit everyone to a Eurosceptic tradition, but there needs to be a real debate on what the European Union actually is, and what makes it such a hybrid and strange creature, which is not only a generation from loads of social rights, but also a generation for a lot of political rights in that way. But that's where I'll leave it for now, I guess.
Okay, cool. Please thank me, and please join me.
Why not?
and spare